Hi everyone, we're going to go through the bones of the axial skeleton in this presentation, including the major landmarks that we're going to expect you to know for next week. We're going to start with the bones and landmarks of the skull. And so it may seem like the skull is made out of one bone. It's actually made out of a bunch of bones that have fused together over time. So starting at the front, we have the frontal bone, and then on the side above our ears we have the temporal bone. Above the temporal bone we have the parietal bone, and in the back of our skull we have the occipital bone. On the front, our lower jaw is made out of the mandible. Our upper jaw is the maxilla. And we have our nose is the nasal bone. And at the corner of our eye is the lacrimal bone. Lacrimal comes from the Latin word for tear. And just behind that, we can see a little hint of a bone called the ethmoid bone. And we also see a hint of a bone called the sphenoid bone. We're going to see these again in a couple of slides. These bones are actually much bigger than we see here, but they're deep inside the skull. You'll notice that there's some other things indicated on here, but I'm going to wait till we get to the next slide to talk about those landmarks. So here is a skull model, and I think it's much easier to see those landmarks here instead of on the colored illustration. So the landmarks that we're going to look at, so we have the frontal and the parietal bones, the temporal bones. So let's look at some of the temporal landmarks. So first we have this little bridge right here, and it's a bridge to our cheekbone. So this bridge is called the zygomatic process. Next we have this hole over here, and this hole is where our outer ear connects to our inner ear. And that's called the external acoustic meatus. It's the external or outside ear hole. We have kind of this depression right here where the mandible fits into the temporal bone, and that's called the mandibular fossa. And just behind your ears, I want everybody to touch behind there now, and you'll feel like this really big bump, and that is called the mastoid process. So those are the landmarks of the temporal bones that I'd like you to know. I'm also going to spend some time looking at the mandible, because the mandible has two landmarks that we can see very nicely here. So that part that goes into the mandibular fossa, that's called the condylar process, right? And then over here, there's another bump, and that bump is called the coronoid process. So be careful with the coronoid process, because a little bit down the road we're also going to learn about a bony landmark called the coracoid process. But in the mandible, it's the coronoid process. Here we're looking at the bottom side of the skull, and we've removed the mandible, okay, just to give us a better view. So here we can see what's called the hard palate. And the hard palate is made out of two bones. Part of it's that upper jawbone called the maxilla, and then behind that is a bone called the palatine bone. We're going to go back a little bit, and a bone that goes from the lower portion of our nose up into the nasal cavity, partially separating it, is called the vomer, and we'll see the vomer a little bit more. And then back here we have the occipital bone, and we also have a little bit of the temporal bone. And I'm going to visit the landmarks of the occipital bone. The first landmark is this big hole, and one of the words for hole when we're talking about bones is a foramen. And so this is a big hole, so it's the foramen magnum. On either side of the foramen magnum are occipital condyles. Now if you watched the last video, you know that a condyle is where another bone one bone articulates with another bone. So they're usually pretty smooth, so there's not a lot of friction. Just in front of the occipital condyle is a hole called the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is where the jugular vein goes through. And just in front of that is another hole for the carotid canal, where the carotid artery goes through. We can also see these on this skull here. So we have the hard palate, we have the foramen magnum, we have the jugular foramen, and the carotid canal. Oh, and we can also see that mastoid process and the mandibular fossa. Again, the mandibular fossa is where the mandible sits in to the temporal bone. It's where that joint is. Now, if we could open our skulls up, you'd see the inside of the skull. So this is looking at the skull underneath where the brain would be. So this is where the brain normally sits. And we're going to start with this little bone here, which is called the ethmoid bone. At the very center of the ethmoid bone is a ridge, and whoever named this ridge thought it looked like the comb of a rooster. And so it's called the crista galli, which means rooster's comb. On either side of the rooster's comb are these plates that are called the cribriform plate. Behind the ethmoid bone is a bone called the sphenoid bone, and often people will say that the sphenoid bone looks like a bat or a butterfly. In the middle of the sphenoid bone, where one would ride a bat or a butterfly if there was a saddle on a bat or a butterfly, is the sella turcica. And then just anterior to the sella turcica are two holes, and these are where the optic nerve travels through. So this would be, roughly where the eyeball is, and then the optic nerve travels through the optic canal. And if you put a stick here and a stick here, they're going to cross in the middle, and they're going to cross at that sella turcica. And this is where the optic chiasma is when we're looking at the brain. And now here we're looking at the skull instead of the illustration. Here we have the crista galli and the cribriform plate of the ethmoid. Here we have the sella turcica and the optic canal of the sphenoid bone. And just so you get a chance to understand what the sphenoid bone would look like if we were to separate it from the rest of the skull, here it is. So here's the wings of the sphenoid. And I'm actually going to go back. So here's the superior view. So here is where you'd ride the sella turcica, and here where the optic nerves are going to pass through in the optic canal. Okay, so again, this is the sphenoid bone. Here's the sella turcica and the optic canal. When you look at the crista galli from the top, it doesn't look like that much of a bone, but look at how intricate the ethmoid bone is. And here you can see those cribriform plates. Anterior view of the skull, we get a kind of a better understanding of how all these bones connect. So from the top, we have the frontal bone. Over here, we have the zygomatic bone, and the zygomatic bone is attached to the temporal bone at that zygomatic process, and also this upper ridge here. Inside the orbit, where the eye is found, we have the lacrimal bone, and we can see a little bit of the ethmoid. But now we can also see the ethmoid dipping into the nasal cavity and connecting to that vomer. That vomer is the bone at the inferior surface of the nasal cavity that divides the two sides. Here we can see some of the sphenoid with that optic canal. We can see the maxilla and the mandible. Here's a better view of how the mandible articulates with the temporal bone. You can see that condylar process connecting and fitting very nicely into that mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Anterior to the condylar process, you can see that coronoid process. This image shows you where the sinuses are found. Sinuses are openings within the bone. And so most of us have had a sinus headache or two throughout our lifetime, so we kind of are aware these are the frontal sinuses, and there are other associated sinuses, but we're just asking you to know about these right now. Later in 218, when you study the respiratory system, we'll go through all of them. And last but not least, below the skull is the hyoid bone. And the coolest thing about the hyoid bone is that it's the only bone that doesn't articulate with another bone. So there's lots of muscle attached to it, but it does not articulate with another bone. And so those are the landmarks of the skull that you need to know.